Texture Anarchy does have one level of undo, and I'm going to hit the Control Z on your Windows machine, Apple Z on the Mac. The thing to point out is that Edit Undo doesn't necessarily work the way you think it's going to. I just tried to edit undo the lighting effect that I had created, and what I wound up doing, I'll redo that, is accessing what Texture Anarchy perceives as the last major change, which was the previous texture that we had loaded in. So sometimes edit undo works the way you would expect it to, and other times your results are a bit unexpected, as just happened to me in the middle of this tutorial. But I'm going to keep this in the tutorial because it's important to show you that while the functionality is there, you always want to make sure that you're aware of the steps that you're taking in Texture Anarchy so that you can re-access the point that you think you're going to. I can also go off screen, go back to my preset manager, and simply load back in that corroded wall texture. There's one more area to the main room of the Texture Anarchy Explorer plugin, and that's what I'll call the layer options. The first of the three layer options is a function that you may recognize from working in Photoshop. This is a series of blend modes, and if I click down, I can bring up the blend menu. And if you're familiar with Photoshop blend modes, then you'll recognize a portion of the blend menu options. I can either click to select a new blend option, or I can simply drag and scroll through all of the blend options. And what blend options do is they blend any imagery in your texture with any imagery that's in the Photoshop layer that you have Texture Anarchy applied to. So if you recall our original Photoshop file, we had the words Texture Anarchy typed and then rasterized onto a single layer. So what you're seeing is the interplay between the pixels of our corroded metal and the pixels of the words Texture Anarchy. I'll leave our blend mode on the dissolve option and show you the opacity control, which is the second of the three layer controls. Opacity works just as it sounds. Once again, you are interacting with the pixels of the layer that Texture Anarchy is applied to, and what we're doing is lowering or raising the opacity level of our texture. If I turn off the blend menu, or rather turn it on to normal so we can see the full texture, and now bring down the opacity, you'll see that the words Texture Anarchy are starting to show through as we make our texture more transparent. The final control in our layer options area works differently than the first two controls. The bump option does not actually interact with the layer in your Photoshop file. Instead, the bump option controls the interplay between the color well and the bump well that we talked about earlier. If you recall, the color well is the gradient of colors that make up the palette of your texture, and the bump is a black and white or grayscale image that simulates the appearance of 3D. The whites simulate the appearance of height, and the blacks simulate the appearance of depth. If I lower my bump option, then you'll see that what simply happens is the appearance of 3D starts to disappear, because what we are increasingly left with is simply the color of the texture. Turning down your bump option is very similar to simply option clicking on the bump well and turning it off. There are some differences. In part, there is a luminosity difference, but that speaks to an entirely different tutorial. So, before we render out our final texture and conclude this tutorial, let me show you one last function in the main room, and that is the level of undo-redo that we stumbled upon earlier. Sometimes undo will work as expected, and other times it doesn't. For instance, if I go back to my bump option and bring it all the way back up to 100%, and then hit my Apple Z key on the Mac or Control Z on Windows, in this case, undo acts as I expect it to. It goes between no bump or a flat texture and a full bump or 100% texture. If, for instance, I bring down my opacity level and then undo and redo that last change, my level of undo acts as expected. If I click down in a mutation well to select that mutation and then do an undo redo, once again my undo acts as expected. If I go to the scale tool and scale down this new texture and then rotate it and then move it and then do my one level of undo, the level of undo in this case accessed the texture that I had loaded in before I clicked in the mutation well. Something to think about in terms of the level of undo is you probably shouldn't rely on it. Instead, you should access your preset manager options, which are along the top of our screen. If you come across something that you really like in terms of a texture that you're working on, you can always go to your Save Preset area of your preset manager, save that preset as a working preset essentially. I'm going to click cancel in this case, and then proceed on with your texture, having saved an earlier iteration of it. Having said that, let's render out our texture. I'm going to edit undo so I can bring back our corroded metal. And off screen I'm going to click the check mark button, which is our apply button. We've applied and rendered our texture, and now we're back in the primary Photoshop interface. The custom interface of Texture Anarchy Explorer has been closed once we hit our apply button. And as you can see, the layer that previously contained the words Texture Anarchy has been replaced with the imagery of the texture that we were working on. And we are left with a three-dimensional, organic-looking, beautiful texture. That concludes this tutorial and our overview of the main room of the plugin called Texture Anarchy Explorer, which is one of 3 plugins within the Texture Anarchy suite. Upcoming tutorials will talk about the 2 rooms that we didn't get into other than a brief glance. Those are the Layer Editor room and the Deep Noise room. And we'll also talk more about the color well and the bump well, which we briefly mentioned, and the alpha well, which we completely ignored. If you like the idea of working with pre-made textures or presets, then you should take a look at our other texture product. That is called Backdrop Designer, and it is similar to Texture Anarchy, except it is a much more simplified way of working with procedural textures. I hope this rather lengthy tutorial was helpful, and hope that you will download the free demo of Texture Anarchy if you haven't already, and take the 3 plugins for a whirl.